And our last presenter is Pat Tolan, PhD. He's a professor of education in psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia. He's also the director of Youth Next, the UVA Center to Promote Effective Youth Development. That's a cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary center to advance prevention of problems affecting youth and to promote healthy development. He earlier directed the Institute for Juvenile Research at the University of Illinois for 10 years. He's an emeritus professor from the University of Illinois. He's conducted longitudinal research on youth psychological and social functioning and carried out randomized prevention and positive youth development promotion trials. Lots of awards. Big prevention scientist, Pat Tolan.
Well, first of all, two very good things I want to say. First is I'm very glad this conversation is occurring because we need to have it, and it's one I think we inside the field have been kind of letting go for a while. It's a thorny, knotty issue. The second is the people who came before me covered most of my talk, so I can get to the slides that I usually do when the red light is on and that I really wanted to talk about. So that's the good news for you and for me. Let's talk about what I think is ultimately a question about getting to utility and getting to going to scale. That's ultimately what these questions are about. But they are also, in their knottiness, very difficult, complex scientific problems. And they have a lot to do with the questions right now that are very present in the field about replication and transparency. I'm not going to talk about those two things today, but I think they get close. I think that's why those things are coming up, because we're expecting science to be useful, our science to be useful, and that's making these questions come up. So the question I was asked by David to say at the end, could you kind of compare the two and give a comparison of how you think about that, or how we should think about that? And one of the first questions is, what are the standards for proof for these different kinds of things? And I have a somewhat different take on these terms. The term programs is pretty much what the previous speaker said, and what Stephen said. And I think of it as it's a complex kind of intervention that has multiple components to it, multiple practices within it. And practices seem to be more of, I think, what Tony's talking about with the kernels. That's how I would think about it. These very specific activities that you could see and you could extract out from multiple programs and say, these things must work because we're in multiple programs. But principles seem to be more of what my colleague Tom Cook has been urging us to look at more carefully in this field. Which is, what's the theory underlying this program? What do you think you're doing? And what is it about these programs that actually they reflect similar theory? They're about the same theory, but that's what, and he's argued, and I think he's persuaded me more and more, we've been hearing him say this, that might be where we need to be aiming ourselves. So I think of principles as maybe a really great idea to be moving forward to, but it's really the underlying theories of risk, pathology, and of health that are guiding our interventions. So the standards for me are the same. I don't care whether it's standing on happy feet or whether it's learning life skills or whether it's that you're now going to create a space for kids to be involved in civic life and therefore feel more connected to community. It's not about that, what you're testing. It's about how you do good science. And it's to get good unbiased trials of those things, find positive effects with no health compromising effects, hopefully, that it can be replicated, and that we try to relate the efforts across these trials. It's about building knowledge overall. It's not about my program works or yours works. And then to start to know about the generalization. So as we were talking about, it's about this program has positive effects for this outcome, for this population under these circumstances. We all say that all the time, but that's really the critical point. And what I'm going to try to argue in a minute is, and here's how it works. Here's what it does to get us there. And that's the piece that's really, I think, been missing quite a bit. And then what are the implementation requirements to do this? So here's what you need to have to do this. Here's what needs to occur. I think those standards are the same, whether you're talking about, again, kernels, practices, or programs. Kernels, principles, or programs. So I could skip this because you already went through this. We talked about the different programs, practices, and principles. This, I'm going to skip, but you can read it if you want to. This is just to remind you what it takes to get to have one of those things. 75 to 80% of our science doesn't get to it works. And it's not supposed to. 75% of the time, you're supposed to fail and learn how to do it better. That's how I disillusion my graduate students in the first week. And so this is we can skip too, because the question was, okay, well, here's what people with programs say is good to do, and Gil did a great job. And then here's what practice is supposed to do, and Tony did a great job. And then we also saw even principles, and Amy did a great job of sort of talking about how do you start to think about principles and moving that forward. And there's what the top part is what people argue is what's great about them, and the space down below where it starts on programs hard to train and under practice, what's the real evidence? That's what people see as the problems with these. And again, they've been covered, so I'm not going to cover those. And I just wanted to say, well, let's think about principles a little bit too, because I don't think they've been investigated very carefully. And I think they have a different organization than kernels. They represent breaking, and I think Stephen got into this. These get into not only what people might call the active ingredients. I think what people mean by active ingredients is the things you do. You know, stand on happy feet, have them do homework notes, make the parents talk to the child this way, those kinds of things. But there's also a whole other part, which is the engagement process, interpersonal relationship part, motivation, all these kinds of things that make whether or not people are going to do any of those things, whether or not it's going to take. There's also principles of behavioral practice. You know, if you don't do something 3 or 4 times, you're just not going to have any uptake. Those kinds of pieces to interventions too that are critically important. And those are principles, I think, that represent something other than your give kids a group reinforcement and they'll behave better. That's a theory about change in behavior. These are principles, I think, of intervention. And so I think they can be broken out into more of interpersonal processes and content and activity. And then also one which we haven't looked at, but a lot of people have started to talk about, particularly those who are doing implementation science, which is how useful is this, and what does it require to be able to go to scale, and what's required to go to scale, and how does that affect what's occurring. To do this kind of work, I think one of the major changes we need are some evaluation of what are the elements of these programs. What are the non-reducible kernels, and what is really going on there? Because Tony told his story from a behavioral perspective of how the field developed. From a systems perspective, the way the field developed is we went out and did some stuff, and we read our textbooks, and we took what people said would probably work, and then we made it a program, and we tested it, and it worked. So it kind of is a circle in the sense of it was the same kind of idea. People read things. It wasn't that somebody woke up one day and said, you know what I think would be really cool is if we taught kids life skills. You know, somebody did some careful science on social development and cognitive development and saw what people were doing and put it into programs, right? So one of the things is this element analysis. The other is starting to look at resistance to non-fidelity. That is, most of these interventions people have talked about, the reason we don't use them is can't put them into place here where we live. In other words, another way to understand it is we want to work in low fidelity systems. We have to work in low fidelity systems. There's turnover. We don't pay these people very much. Often the people who are doing this kind of work, the plans are if we're ever going to do it, it has to be people who don't have a lot of skills and a lot of pain. But we don't, so how do you test those interventions? So they've done some of this in child welfare, where they assume they're going to have relatively low fidelity systems. In other words, people who do good child welfare work get moved up to administration or get burned out and leave. And people who aren't so good tend to stay in the front line a lot. And so they want to design systems for that. So how can we start to think about that? And then the other important point is to pay very careful attention to the important work David McKinnon's been doing the last few years in particular, where he's really developed this concept of how do you test out the how of what works. And not only how it works, but how it doesn't work. Create a counterfactual of the thing that you don't think you're changing that could explain the outcome. And also he started to work on this idea of multiple mediators and cascading mediators. And these are really wonderful ways for us to start to get inside what the black box that we've all talked about is important to do. And so starting to do that kind of thing, I think that's where we could start to get some of the principles that we're talking about and get out of this practices versus programs and really get to what are key parts of prevention that make a difference and that these programs reflect. So this is what I wanted to spend time on, and I'm still on yellow. Good. Okay. The benchmark approach is a la Mark Lipsey. That's been referred to. What Mark did was he went and took his meta-analyses and said, here's what seems to make programs work, and rather than getting you to try and do my program, I'm going to come along with this list and some people, and we're going to coach you and benchmark you against these lists. And the more you do things like this list says you did, the better you're going to do, and they put some financial backing to it and so on. Now, he's in the midst of that trial. We don't know the results, but the question is whether that's going to lead to better outcomes than trying to get people to do our prescribed programs. I think we need to look at it. The McKinnon mediation work, the personalization of effects idea that Jerry was talking about today, that prevention is, one of the things prevention has taught us is that populations that we even think are homogeneous demographically or by risk are heterogeneous. Another perspective that's coming out of positive development is, think about a Boys and Girls Club. There's about 16 kids in this game playing, or 10 kids playing basketball, let's say. And one of the kids is getting off the street and kept safe. One of the kids is getting an adult finally paying good, positive attention. One's learning how to negotiate problems without fighting. One of them's learning how to have friends that they didn't know how to do before. One of them's actually finally the most competent at something because they're a good basketball player. So those kids are all in the same intervention. They're getting very different things. There's a guy named John Eckerode who's been trying, I messed up his name. Anyway, trying to look at that question. Yeah, of how do you look at the idea that these prevention programs actually might be doing multiple things when we assume they're doing one. So trying to look at that. Another thing that comes out of the ABA area and so on is this idea of disassembly, which is to start to take our programs apart. What if I took something out? Would it still work? We don't do that. Psychotherapy people do this a lot, and we don't tend to do that, and it's a critical part of the work we should do. The other thing they do is the other way, which is they go in and say, what's the minimum I could do? Let's see if it gets an effect. I don't know how many times I've lost arguments with colleagues where I said, let's just do this little thing and see if it makes a difference. No, we got to do this, and this, and this, and give them everything we can to make sure we have an effect. And there's a different approach there that really could be very informative. And I think those could be next steps towards helping us understand what usability. And then the last one, which is, this is a grand design. This is the big study, the $25 million study or something, the $20 million study. Maybe we could do it for 10 if we really got it. But we've never tested this idea, which is critical to our field, which what if we gave people really good consulting and technical aid in developing the program they want to develop homegrown, versus we gave them a very good prescriptive program and helped them implement it well. We've tested the second one out a lot, and we tested it against nothing or do whatever you want. But we've never tested what happens if somebody came in and said, let me give you the best advice we can on how to make your program work well, versus here's how you do my program well. And we need to do that, because that may in fact if that turns out to be true, that what really people need is technical assistance, we've got a huge potential here at a much smaller price than what we're currently talking about doing. I'll stop there. Thank you.